Before we begin today's program that celebrates America's independence and freedoms, we want to take a moment to acknowledge the tragic violence that was experienced right here in Illinois over the holiday weekend. Our thoughts are with those impacted, and hopefully we can find comfort in the words expressed by President Lincoln in his annual message to Congress on December 3, 1861. The struggle of today is not altogether for today, it is for a vast future also. In the midst of the recent tragedy, we're reminded of a hopeful future and better days ahead, as evidenced by yesterday's installation of Lisa Holder White as the first black woman to serve on the Illinois Supreme Court during a special ceremony that took place here at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. Thank you. Now today's program of Tales from the Vault, a collaborative effort between the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, the Illinois State Museum, and the Lincoln Home with the National Park Service. Today, our Acquisitions Chief, Ian Hunt, will show items from the ALPLM's vast collection that have a connection to America's founding, highlighted by an opportunity to see our copy of the Gettysburg Address. Written in Lincoln's hand, it's only one of 5 copies in existence. Lincoln's address connected the struggle of the Civil War to the signing of the Declaration of Independence and has since been regarded as one of the most powerful expressions of freedom and liberty. You'll also see and learn about how Lincoln's grandfather fought in the American Revolution and his purchase of a fife and drum for his soldiers, and how subsequent generations of Americans have celebrated our nation's independence. You'll see displays of patriotism and how our nation has grown since those faithful days in 1776. For those of you watching on Facebook and those of you here in our live audience, you'll have a chance to ask some questions in a Q&A session following the presentation. And for those of you here in the audience in person at the library today, you'll also have a chance to see these incredible items up close and take some photos afterwards. We ask is that you please do not use your flash photography. Now to tell you about today's Tales from the Vault program, a celebration of America's independence and freedoms, here's our Acquisitions Chief, Ian Hunt. Ian, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, guys. How is everyone today? Glad to hear that. When I was approached about doing this topic, I really tried to think about what are the things that we have here in the collection that relate to American independence. And we have a number of items, but then I thought, independence goes far beyond just the creation. Independence is something that we celebrate every year. It's something, honestly, that most of us should celebrate every day. So I started looking at the collection and I started thinking about things that not only dealt with the founding of our nation, but also helped to evoke those memories, those ideas, those concepts, not only going back to 1776, but coming all the way into the modern era. So we're going to dive right in. We're going to go kind of chronologically. Of course, we will save the Gettysburg Address, which is arguably the best for last, so we'll have to jump over that one just slightly. But we'll just move right along here, and if you have questions, I will be happy to answer them, I believe, when we get to the end. So the first item that I'm going to talk a little bit about is a book that is unfortunately in very poor condition. The covers are coming off of it. We didn't do that. We got it this way. This book may not look like much to most people, but it is actually incredibly important to our nation's history. This is the Constitution of the Several Independent States of America, and it was first published in 1781. In fact, it's one of only 200 copies that were ever published. As the Revolutionary War was raging, the Continental Congress decided that what this emerging nation needed was an expression of itself, and a notice to the world that a new country was being born. And so on December the 29th of 1780, the Continental Congress voted to compile all of these documents that had already been created up to that point. And that included the Declaration of Independence, that included several state constitutions that had already been written, that included the Articles of Confederation, and it also included all of the treaties that had been signed between the fledgling United States and the country of France. This document predates the American Constitution actually by 7 years. In fact, when the framers of our Constitution in 1787 decided to sit down and hash out exactly what would our nation's framework, our legal framework be, they went back to this book and they actually looked at the state constitutions that had already been written. As one legal scholar has already pointed out, the basic structure of the federal Constitution of 1787 was modeled after the existing state constitutions writ large. Now, these differed from pamphlets and newspapers, articles on the same subject in that they institutionalized the American type of Republican government as part of the struggle for independence. A decade before the Constitution, they helped to provide the foundation of a legally enforceable right in the early Republic. Now, why was this so important for this to be put out? Why on earth would the Continental Congress feel a need to make this declaration? Well, it's because they wanted to demonstrate not just to Great Britain, but to the world that we were an emerging new nation, that this was not simply a backwater colonial uprising that Great Britain would be easily able to put down and that we would once again be loyal members of the crown. They wanted to make a definitive statement. We are here. We will not be ignored. You need to recognize us as our own independent nation. So this is one of only 200 copies that were ever printed. 1782, they printed additional copies. They printed revised standards. Several of the what would soon become states had written constitutions by that time, so they added several of them. One of the things I find most interesting in this book is that when they list out the constitutions, which are actually the first part of the book, they do not go alphabetically. They actually go from north to south. So New Hampshire is actually the first constitution that you read about, and then it goes down through Massachusetts and Vermont and so on and so forth. Clearly, they had an idea of how they were going to arrange this book, and geographically seemed much more common sense to them for some reason than alphabetically. So New Hampshire is the very first one that you read when you dive into that. So we're gonna technically move back a couple of years. This is one of my favorite pieces in the collection. This dates to 1777, July of 1777. So just 1 year after the Declaration of Independence had been written. And it is a receipt for a fife and drum, and it is signed by Colonel Abraham Lincoln. Now, I get a lot of people who say to me, well, wait a minute, I don't think Abraham Lincoln fought in the American Revolutionary War. He actually did. His grandfather fought in the American Revolutionary War, fought with a Virginia regiment, led that Virginia regiment successfully, would survive the war, of course, later moving to Kentucky, where his famous grandson would be born. But President Abraham Lincoln was actually named for his paternal grandfather, Colonel Abraham Lincoln. It actually has Grandpa's signature at the bottom. I just call him Grandpa. It's way easier than trying to say President or Colonel. It's got Grandpa's signature at the bottom. And the other thing that moves me about this is that when you think about the American Revolutionary War, there really is very few more iconic images than the three soldiers marching, one with a fife, one with a drum, and one with a flag. Do you guys take that? You good? They want to talk to you. So this is a receipt to help create that kind of iconic image of the three soldiers. Moving on, I seem to be moving rather rapidly here. We're going to jump all the way into 1840. Now, today, political campaigns are happy to evoke ideals of America, to use images that reference back to our nation's independence. But this is not a modern invention. Political campaigns have been using this kind of material, this kind of hearkening back to our founding, almost all the way back to the beginning of political campaigns. So this is an 1840 William Henry Harrison campaign flag. It is silk. It has 13 stars with a central star in the middle. On the cover, you see Harrison. You see an image of a very rustic log cabin, And you get a quote that says, "If you ever come to Vincennes, call at my cabin, and you will not find the door shut or the string pulled in." Now, what this was referencing was Harrison's persona that he had created for this 1840 campaign. Harrison is kind of a funny candidate. He is born into incredible wealth and privilege. He grows up in a beautiful plantation home in Virginia, but when he comes west, fighting in the military, becomes an Indian fighter, he capitalizes on this notion that he is a blue-collar, hard-working man of the people. He's campaigning on this notion of Tippecanoe and Tyler too, which he had fought at the Battle of Tippecanoe. He's the hard cider candidate. He's the guy who you want to sit down with in a bar on Friday night and have a couple of rounds with. He portrays his opponent in the 1840 election, President Van Buren, as being an out-of-touch aristocrat who is more concerned with his own personal looks and his own personal life than he is with the effects of the country. What Harrison is trying to capitalize on is that in 1840, the country is still reeling from the 1837 financial panic, which had been caused in part by President Andrew Jackson and by Martin Van Buren. Banks had been closing, inflation was skyrocketing, people were out of work, and Harrison sees this opportunity to jump into this race and really make his mark as a candidate. So he will challenge Van Buren. He will end up defeating Van Buren. It's okay, Bob. He will end up defeating Van Buren, and then he will go on, of course, to make his own unique history. Mr. Harrison, partially in an effort to combat this public persona that had been created around him, that he was this kind of hardworking, blue-collar, Indian fighting, beer drinking kind of guy, decides that he is going to give an hour-and-a-half long inaugural address. And he wants to prove how incredibly tough he is, so he is not wearing an overcoat. It is March in Washington, D.C. It is cold, it is raining. And during the course of this 90-minute inaugural address, I believe still the longest inaugural address given in our nation's history, he begins to catch a sniffle. 32 days later, he will die in office. The shortest term that a U.S. president serves, he will be the first president to die in office. They weren't honestly 100% sure about what they should do. Congress debated after the death of William Henry Harrison whether or not they should simply have another election because his term had been so short. His running mate, who would become President Tyler, said, no, the Constitution lays it out. I'm supposed to take over. I'm now the president. So there was actually a fight going on in Washington, D.C. in the immediate aftermath of President Harrison's death because no one was sure exactly of what situation should be implemented. The other thing that is beautiful about this flag is that you can see, if you get close enough, you can see he actually has the barrel of hard cider sitting right outside his cabin. So you can be guaranteed that when you come to visit Harrison, not only are you going to be welcomed into his home, but you're going to have a drink to enjoy while you're there. So we're going to skip this. We'll come back to this, I promise. Don't worry. I know that's why you're all here. You're not here for me. You're here for this. I understand. So, I appreciate that. I need all the help I can get, trust me. So this is one of the things that actually celebrates the 4th of July. And I know it's going to be very hard for you guys to read, and I'm going to welcome you guys to all come up and take a closer look at it. But what this is the July 2nd / July 4th copy of the Vicksburg Daily Citizen from 1863. Now, why this is so special is that in May of 1863, General Ulysses S. Grant had begun siege operations against the city of Vicksburg. It had been an incredibly strong fortification along the Mississippi River for the Confederates. It had disrupted Union River traffic since the onset of the war. Vicksburg was kind of the Gibraltar of the Confederate war effort along the Mississippi River. So when Grant begins siege operations, he literally surrounds the city and will not allow anything to go into the city or anything, of course, to come out. And the citizens of Vicksburg hold on for quite a while. They are struggling. They are trying to make do with what they have access to. When their newspaper runs out of normal paper in which to print newspapers on, they raid a warehouse in the city of Vicksburg that is full of wallpaper. And they begin printing the newspaper on the back of wallpaper so that they can create some semblance of normalcy in the city of Vicksburg. This is wallpaper that they've printed this on. Now, why this one is so special is that when the soldiers, mostly Illinois soldiers, mostly Illinois regiments, but there were others, but when the soldiers actually got into the city on July the 4th, when the Confederates finally capitulated, they went and got into the newspaper offices, and they found that the July the 2nd run for the paper was still sitting on the printing presses, waiting to be put out, and that there were still areas of the paper that hadn't been filled in. They had not completed all of their stories. So there were a handful of Union soldiers who had experience in newspaper printing, so they added their own story to the very end. And their own story talks about how General Grant is now dining in the city of Vicksburg and enjoying the hospitalities of the great people of Mississippi. So it's funny, because when you read the first columns, it's all anti-Union, pro-Confederate war news, and then you get to the end and it talks about how Grant is now enjoying the hospitality of the city. There were only a handful of these that were printed out. They actually come on different kinds of wallpaper. We only have this copy in our collection. The Smithsonian, I believe, has 4 different copies on 4 different types of wallpaper. But these are so rare that the Smithsonian has actually put out guides to tell you what is the real wallpaper versus what are the fakes. Because, of course, after the war, one of the things that many of the regiments, when they would come together again to celebrate their accomplishments, whether it be GAR reunions or just veterans reunions after the war, they would print these up on wallpaper and hand them out as souvenirs. So they weren't trying to create necessarily forgeries like we would think of today. They were simply creating mementos for the soldiers who had been there. Well, a lot of those soldiers came home and put those things in their attic, and then their great-grandchildren found them decades later and said, oh my God, we've got an original copy. If the wallpaper doesn't match precisely, and if the printing doesn't match precisely, you don't have an original copy. So, but this is one of them. And you can actually see the letter, the mast of the paper up here. Unfortunately, the Vicksburg has been torn off, but you can still see Daily Citizen right here. Again, I'm happy to have you guys come up, happy to talk to you guys about these. Now this is jumping forward ever so slightly. This is jumping to 1889. And this is a calling card that was presented to Robert Todd Lincoln while he was ambassador to the court of St. James in Great Britain. Robert, we tend to overlook Robert because he is the son of Abraham Lincoln. We tend to not think about his accomplishments. Robert was a highly accomplished individual in his own right. He is a captain in the United States Army. He is a graduate of Harvard University. He is Secretary of War under Presidents Garfield and Arthur. He is appointed ambassador to the court of St. James. He becomes the private attorney for the Pullman Car Company. And after the death of its leadership, its founder, he would be appointed CEO of the Pullman Car Company. So he was actually in charge of what was the largest corporation in the world at that time. He's an incredibly accomplished individual. This, again, is from 1889. This was from his service as ambassador to the court of St. James. This is the calling card of a Mrs. C. Wardell. She is actually a very famous actress who had begun acting in the 1860s as a child. As a 7-year-old child, she was a Shakespearean actress and would continue acting all the way up into the 1920s when she finally passed away. Robert, as ambassador, not only would it have been common for people in London to have called upon Robert on holidays like the 4th of July, which of course isn't celebrated in London, but given his status as the son of the great martyred hero, he was literally a magnet for this type of stuff. He would often have people who simply wanted to be around him, simply wanted to shake his hand, have an opportunity to spend a few moments with him. So this is one way in 1889 when he would have been sitting around his flat in London, probably taking the day off from his duties as an ambassador, but he would have simply been inundated all day long with various people who were stopping by just simply to say hi and present their card to him. So we're going to jump into the 20th century. What we have here is, this is from our audiovisual collection. This is the sound and light shows that were held at the old state capitol here in Springfield nightly, beginning on July the 4th of 1976 and moving all the way through September 11th of that year. 1976 was, of course, the National Bicentennial. Cities all over the country celebrated the National Bicentennial in different ways. Most of them did not simply stop on the 4th of July. Most of these celebrations were year-long. There were extravaganzas, there were educational readings, there were concerts, there were, as you can see, light shows. Everyone in the country wanted, in their own special way, to be able to celebrate that America had made it for 200 years as a democracy. Of course, as you all know, if we're going to do something in Springfield, we have to include a certain individual in it. So you have an image of Mr. Lincoln with the backdrop of the old state capitol. But this was just one way that the city of Springfield decided that they were going to celebrate America's independence. So with that, we're going to jump into what you guys all came to see. Yeah. She's excited. So this is one of 5 handwritten copies of the Gettysburg Address, written in President Lincoln's own hand. We do not know where the reading copy of the Gettysburg Address is, whatever he used that day in November of 1863 while standing on the dais at Gettysburg. That unfortunately has been lost to history. But the 5 copies that do exist, the first 2, known as the Nicolay and Hay copies, are unfinished. They are both at the Library of Congress. They have scratch outs. They are written in pencil, pen, and pencil. There are omissions. They are obviously draft copies. And the reason I tell you guys this is that there's been a wise tale that's been going around for more than a century that Abraham Lincoln wrote the Gettysburg Address on the back of an envelope on the train ride from Washington, D.C. to Gettysburg. That's not true. I would love to be able to tell you that he was so brilliant, he was so eloquent, that he was able to form this incredible speech that literally changed the course of our nation's history in the span of an hour-and-a-half train ride. But I can't. That would be a lie. And the reality is much, much greater. Lincoln, when he was asked to speak at this event, understood the historical significance of dedicating this national cemetery at this battlefield that had seen such horrific casualties that summer. So he was not going to fool with the speech. He was not going to wing it. He was not going to give it a half effort. Instead, he was going to sit down and take the time to make sure that the words that he were going to convey were going to have the proper meaning. So you have the 2 draft copies that are both at the Library of Congress. As I've already said, the reading copy has been lost to history, unfortunately. Now, this is the first copy that is written after the president actually delivers his remarks. This is what's known as the Edward Everett copy, and we call it that because Everett actually approached the president after the speeches were done. Let me back up a second, I apologize. Edward Everett was the other speaker that day at Gettysburg. Ironically, no one remembers him. He gave a 2-hour-long speech that was 14,755 words long. He did the entire speech from memory. Everett was one of the leading speakers of that era. He had been governor of Massachusetts. He had been president of Harvard University. He had been a senator. He was literally one of the leading orators. He is who you have to thank if you ever go to visit Mount Vernon, President Washington's ancestral home, because Mount Vernon was literally collapsing in on itself in the 1840s. And Everett went on a national speaking tour and dedicated all of the money that was raised by that speaking tour to the Mount Vernon Ladies Association so that Mount Vernon could be refurbished. So if you get the chance to go see that beautiful location, make sure you have a drink for Edward Everett, because he deserves it. So Everett's speech that day was actually a lot like Lincoln's. What Everett talked about were the great battles in history. He talked about Marathon. He talked about Waterloo, places like that. And he then tried to set where Gettysburg would fit within that kind of pantheon of great military victories. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is 272 words long. It takes about 3.5 minutes to say. So you can see the difference in the two speeches. But Everett said to the president, "I can only hope, sir, that I was able to convey in 2 hours what you were able to convey in 2 minutes." And he said, "May I please have a copy of your remarks from that day?" He was going to bind his speech along with notes, images of the major military figures that had been at Gettysburg, maps of the battlefield. He was going to bind them all together in a book, and it was going to be sold at the New York Sanitary Fair. Sanitary fairs, before you raise your eyebrow and say, well, why is he doing this? Sanitary fairs were a way for cities to raise money for wounded soldiers, for widows, for orphans. This was a good thing that he was doing. So he had asked the president whether or not he could have a copy of the remarks. He even sent the president the paper so that it would fit within the book. When you look at our copy, if you look very closely in the upper right-hand corners, you'll see numbers 57 and 58. Everett's speech is 1 through 56. That'll give you an idea. The book was purchased by the wife of Senator Hamilton Fish at that New York Sanitary Fair, we believe for probably $10,000, which would have been a huge sum of money. It passed through a number of private collectors until 1943. World War II was raging, of course. The governor of Illinois at that time felt that the nation needed a patriotic pick-me-up. It was made aware that this would be going up for auction, that the last collector that had it was done with it and was looking essentially to cash out on it. And so the governor reached out, a price was negotiated, and the governor thought, what better way to bring this treasure home than to appeal to the school children of Illinois to save their pennies? And that's exactly what happened. A statewide campaign went out asking the school children to bring this national treasure back here to Illinois where it belonged. Thankfully, the department store magnate Marshall Field III stepped in and said, I will cover whatever the children cannot. So between the children of Illinois and Marshall Field III, a check was written, and this wonderful document was brought back to the state of Illinois in 1943. We actually have the entire book that Everett created. When the document arrived here, our conservators at the time decided it would be best to actually remove the Gettysburg Address from the last 2 leaves of the book. I don't know today whether our conservation staff would make that decision. They're shaking their head no. But at the time, that's what was thought to be best for it. So that is why it is removed, but we do have pages 1 through 56 in the original binding downstairs, locked up in the vault. So,
Do you have a complete copy?
This is a complete copy. This is... Oh, well, Everett only created one of them. There was only one. So, and everything in it was handwritten. Everything in it is handwritten. So we do have the complete copy. We have the only copy. You just got to go to this frame to get the last 2 pages. Now, the reason I brought this out, because I know you're going to say, well, Ian, this wasn't given on the 4th of July. It really doesn't, you're stretching the boundaries here. And I admit, I am stretching the boundaries. I just really wanted to see whether they'd let me take it out of the vault. It takes a lot of begging and pleading. But if you read the speech, if you think about the speech, literally the first line, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Lincoln is hearkening back to our Declaration of Independence. He's hearkening back to the creation of this country. 80, a score is 20 years. So what he's saying is 87 years ago, our country was founded. And the speech goes on, and then of course, in the second half of the speech, Lincoln talks about a new birth of freedom, that the sacrifices that were being made by the men and women on the battlefields, not just at Gettysburg, but at places like Shiloh and Vicksburg and Antietam and Fredericksburg and so on, that those sacrifices would not be in vain. That because of those sacrifices, that we were getting a new birth to our nation, a new birth of freedom, and that we were creating a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, that shall not perish from the earth. So he's invoking our Declaration of Independence, and he's also illustrating that our sacrifices will create a new Declaration of Independence, that we will become a new nation out of all of this terror. This is probably my favorite thing in the collection. So, I think I went way faster than I was supposed to. It's 12:30. I am happy to try to answer any, I already got hands up.
Yes, thank you for your presentation today, Ian. And for those of you watching online on Facebook, please let us know if you've got a question. We'll share it with our audience here. A few people have their hands up. Let's start right back here. Good afternoon.
Thank you. I understand that of the 5 copies, 2 or 3 have the words "under God" in them and the others don't. You talked about the 2 draft copies were written before the thing. Do you know whether they had "under God" in it? And does your version have "under God" in it?
They do not have, what are known as the Nicolay and Hay copies, do not have the words "under God." There is some debate about whether President Lincoln said "under God" when actually delivering the speech in November of '63. A researcher recently pointed out that they figured out where the original speaker's dais was at the dedication, and that once you had climbed up on that speaker's platform, you would have looked out at a massive crowd, but beyond the massive crowd would have been caskets still waiting to be interred in graves, stacked in the background. And some historians have theorized that perhaps Lincoln was moved by this sight as he's looking out across the crowd and literally seeing still the sacrifices that had been made, that he may have added "under God" to the statement. Ours is the first written copy that has "under God." And you can see it if you want to walk up when they get done, or when they tell you you can. The other 2 copies, what are known as the Bancroft and Bliss copies, both have it as well. So clearly, once he wrote it in our copy, he liked it, because he added it to the last 2 he wrote.
Right here.
Thank you, Joe. Ian, about a year and a half ago, I was in Washington, D.C., and I was so excited to go to the Library of Congress and take a tour. And I asked security, I asked the site interpreter, I want to see the Nicolay and Hay copies of the Gettysburg Address. They said it's not here. It's at National Archives. Now, unless something's changed, that is where they are, at National Archives in Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm. and they usually bring them down to the Library of Congress to display them.
All right, any other questions for Ian? Right up here. Go right ahead.
Hey, Joe. How are you? How old that Gettysburg Address, how old?
How old?
Yeah.
Well, it was written in early February of 1864. I'm not a mathematician. 74, 84, 94. There you go. I'm gonna take their word for it. So yeah, it would be 158 years old.
All right, right here.
The item that's printed on the wallpaper, how did that happen to come to our library?
That came home with one of the soldiers who had been serving in Vicksburg. And we've actually had this in the collection for quite a long time. It was donated in the early 20th century by the descendants of that soldier. People tend to forget that while these buildings may have opened this one in October of 2004 and the one across the street in April of 2005, we actually are built upon the foundations of the old Illinois State Historical Library, which has been collecting since 1889. So we've been collecting for 130 plus years at this point.
Well, so are.
Yeah. So.
Any other questions? Don't be shy. Ian's glad to answer any and all
Someone's got a
questions
question.
for you.
I saw a hand go up.
Yeah,
I saw
there was-
a little hand go up.
Right over here. I'll get to you so everybody else can hear.
Which is good, because I can't get my kids to ask me questions.
You said that Everett was going to combine these two speeches to sell, to make money. So he never did actually follow through on making other copies to sell? Is that correct?
No, so with the sanitary fairs, one of the ways that they raised money was they were getting original materials. They would often go to famous people and ask them to donate items, or they would have items that were created because they weren't looking to sell in every bookstore in America a copy of this. They were looking to sell one unique copy that would bring a massive sum of money for the benefit of wounded soldiers. So Everett's book, he only created one. And again, it's all his handwritten notes. It's images of several of the generals who fought in the battle. It's maps from the battlefield, and then it's all of his writings originally along with the president's writings. So it was never going to make the New York Times bestseller list. It was never going to be widely published. Now, the historian George Bancroft, which is why you have another copy of the Gettysburg Address called the Bancroft copy, asked the president for a copy of his remarks because he was writing a book on the great speeches in American history, and he wanted to include the Gettysburg Address. So it was published in books, absolutely, but Everett wasn't specifically trying in that case. He was literally making a one-off, hoping to draw the most amount of money possible.
All right, well, very good. We want to say thank you to everyone attending here in person, as well as our audience worldwide on our Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum Facebook page. Thanks for tuning in. Again, our thanks to our Chief of Acquisitions here at the ALPLM, Ian Hunt, for bringing you this presentation this afternoon. And now that we're off here on Facebook, we invite those of you